listeners. I'm Kathy Fang with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host Amjad Hall is joined by TJ Demos, professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at University of California, Santa Cruz, and director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. Together, they chat about TJ's book, Radical Futurisms, Ecologies of Collapse, Chronopolitics, and Justice to Come. They also discuss the question of climate justice and visual culture and fossil fascism. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again. This week we have a special guest. TJ Demos is joining us. Welcome, TJ.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, TJ, I'm wondering if we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Sure. I'm a professor within the Department of Art History and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz, on land that has been long claimed by the Ohlone people, the Awaswas-speaking Ohlone people, whose descendants, the Amamutsan, are currently struggling for sovereignty and land back and against extractive projects in the area. My training is in art history, and I also have brought a strong political focus to my work. So I'll also have some background as an activist and organizer, specifically with DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. So in some ways, my practice is multifaceted. It's as a teacher, a professor, a researcher, but also as someone who engages in politics on the ground.
Mm-hmm. So TJ, as an art historian, cultural critic, political organizer, when did you first start thinking and writing about ecology?
That was around 2007 or 8. And I was living in London at the time. I lived and worked there for 10 years between 2005 and 15. And I was, like many people, becoming increasingly aware of the climate crisis that was developing in all sorts of ways. I had moved to London soon after Hurricane Katrina had happened in New Orleans. And as many of us know who follow that, this was a major environmental disaster that also had strong social and political and racial components to it in terms of how it unfolded, specifically and particularly in relationship to the African American community that was hugely impacted by the hurricane at the time. So I was, thinking about this without it being a focus of my research for a while, when I was invited to write something about it for an exhibition that was happening in London at the Barbican Gallery. And that became the essay that I wrote on the politics of sustainability in relation to art and ecology, where I was interested in seizing that opportunity and thinking about this term sustainability, which was, in my perspective, subject to all manner of greenwashing. Where sustainability ultimately meant what I found in my research, economic sustainability more than anything else. For instance, ecological sustainability. So that was really the beginning of what became a long-term and ongoing research project for me, an engagement with political ecology and thinking about how to push back ultimately on what I would call maybe like liberal green ecology and the dominance of green capitalism that we're still struggling with these days.
Yeah, so wondering if you can start with the decolonizing nature, contemporary art, and the politics of ecology, and a little bit about the background of the project and what you were thinking through at the time.
Decolonizing nature came out of that essay, The Politics of Sustainability, in some ways, and there's a revised version of that essay in the book. But in that essay, I offer a genealogy of this term and how it's developed and changed over the last few decades, both in ways that are conservative and liberal in their conceptual and practical frameworks, and also ways that they've been radicalized in artistic and activist practices. And I wanted to develop that more, and I did so in that book in part by grappling with other aspects of the environmental and climate crisis in terms of, for instance, relating it to the larger project of capitalism and its blowback ecologically, as well as connecting it to different kinds of conflicts and contradictions within society and politics more broadly. For instance, migration or climate refugee conditions, extractivism within different areas from India to Latin America, and other ways of conceiving of ecology within emerging discursive practices, specifically within new materialism and speculative realism, these sorts of developments, which I wanted to think about, again, putting some political pressure on these terms to contest ultimately the growing formation of ecology within a green capitalist framework. So that was a big part of the book, as well as expanding beyond the Euro-American focus of much environmentalism, especially as it entered into the contemporary art world, or at least that was my perspective at the time. It was, ecology was beginning to trend in many ways in contemporary art. It still is, and was largely focused within the European context, within particularly exhibitions, biennials, as thematic focuses of major shows, and more broadly within curatorial projects, as well as in the States. But not much attention had been granted or given to developments theoretically and also artistically and politically within areas outside of that context. So I was Decolonizing Nature offered a container for me to do some research in different areas of the world and try to think about broader conditions of radicalizing ecology or decolonizing nature outside of that Euro-American context.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about the kind of ecological discourses not landing down politically, socially, artistically, sometimes it really resonates with me. When I was doing my doctoral work, I was trying to bring Badiou's work into ecology, and I was reading, I've got on my shelf all these sort of environmental ethics textbooks and stuff that was all about the individual and deciding to recycle or not, and finding it really lacking in terms of a political sensibility or an outside. And I think maybe particularly in the world of visual arts, there was kind of a desire of an outside that was a space that maybe allowed for circulation there that resonated with people. Yeah, and I'm wondering, in your project, the Against the Anthropocene, of course, we see this word being thrown around, a lot of critique of that term as well, but you did a frontal critique of it as well. And wondering if you can speak about that project where you take a critical lens, do the framing around the ecological crisis, and how areas are being articulated and projects are being built out of that, and also how the field of visual culture and art takes these questions on.
Yeah, the Anthropocene thesis was another node of trending ecological discourse in the teens and earlier, but especially the way it was taken up within the cultural sector and the arts during those years in the early teens. And Latour was indeed part of this. I felt like that was, part of the motivation behind the book, which I thought of as the time as a kind of almost like a manifesto. I wanted to write something that was short, that was polemical, that made a strong, or attempted to make a strong political intervention within the way that this terminological, geological conception was unfolding. The problems with that I had with it were that the Anthropocene read to me as a kind of neo-universalist discourse, in the sense that it presumed that this was happening because of so-called human activities, and it was happening everywhere. And the way that got articulated was to basically erase causal differentiation, the fact that some people, some nation states were much more culpable and responsible for the causality behind climate disaster than others. And it tended to disavow the unevenness of impacts, right? That the Anthropocene or the kinds of climate transformations that the Anthropocene inaugurates really affect people in different places in very different ways, in ways that really depend on what kind of resources and economies and political conditions people are living within and have access to. So, by now it's pretty clear within political ecology and climate justice discussions that it's understood that climate disaster generally tends to affect the most vulnerable in ways that are the harshest, precisely because they have the least access to resources. It's what someone like Mike Davis would call an unnatural disaster. When something like Katrina unfolds, it's going to impact some people much more than others, depending on the convergence of race, class, and other social factors. So the Anthropocene as a thesis tended to disregard all of that in ways that I found really objectionable. And I wanted to offer a corrective, or at least intervene and put some things on the table that would challenge some of these ideas, including the notion that if the Anthropocene provides an analysis of the problem, it also preempts certain approaches to solving it. And I found this also in the logic of the Anthropocene, that it specifically, in the way that it describes the problem, ends up calling for and opening up the possibility for specifically technoscientific solutions, specifically geoengineering and carbon capture. In other words, more green capitalism, which connects broadly to the argument of disaster capitalism of Naomi Klein and others. That this was kind of the perversity of climate breakdown, that even as it's happening, even as it's caused by capitalism is setting up the conditions to profit from that disaster and worsen it in many ways. So I was attempting to, in this book, intervene in that logic and challenge it, as well as some of the figures at the time that seemed to be, or were actually connected to these developments, like Latour, who for some time actually supported the work of, for instance, the Breakthrough Institute. This is an eco-modernist think tank in California, in the Bay Area, that has long supported technological interventions as the prioritized ways of approaching climate disaster. So they've supported geoengineering, with which Latour ultimately also supported with some complex arguments. But I found, as is often the case with Latour, there's a disavowal of really concrete political challenges in his theorizations. For me, also, the Anthropocene possessed an aesthetic element in the way that visual practitioners, including artists, but not only artists, were using it as a lens to configure visuality, often through the use of satellite imagery, new technologies of visuality that produced this view from nowhere that would look at the earth and analyze conditions of transforming environments. This is what, for instance, Donna Haraway, who's a colleague of mine, calls the God trick, that this production of a view from nowhere, which has no situated basis in social conditions or political reality. So that was being mobilized to support the problematic ideological assumptions of the Anthropocene thesis. And you see this in the work of like photographers like Edward Bertinsky and others that I ended up discussing in that book, in order to challenge the aestheticization of the Anthropocene as something that ultimately affirms human narcissism at the level of species being through visuality. So that was something that I wanted to contend with. At the same time, trying to contribute argumentation for the support of alternative terms, like, for instance, the racial capitalocene, which I find is much more politically enabling. It names the causality behind climate breakdown really clearly, and it opens up political options in terms of how we address it in ways that don't artificially divide climate science from social science, but actually insists on thinking the two together through, for instance, political ecology. So I'm thinking about this term, racial capitalocene. Lots of people have written about elements of this term, from Jason Moore to Françoise Vergès. But I think that that's really a useful corrective to the Anthropocene thesis, even though I acknowledge at the same time, like, the Anthropocene is not going away. This is going to be the term of choice that's broadly used. But more recently, I've been interested in ways that the Anthropocene thesis is being mobilized within a critical framework, for instance, I've been reading the book of Kohei Sato, Marx and the Anthropocene, towards an idea of degrowth communism, which I find really compelling in mobilizing the term Anthropocene critically within an anti-capitalist framework in support of eco-socialism, or rather what he ultimately argues for, which is degrowth communism.
Yeah, it seems that some writers like Amitav Ghosh, some of his ideas align very strongly with that, even though he doesn't use the term himself. In your book, Beyond the World's End, you again tie together artistic and activist responses to existential environmental questions at stake. And near the beginning of the book, you write, we're entering the end game, the terminal point of democracy, of liberalism, of capitalism, of a cool planet, of the Anthropocene, of the end of the world as we know it. Pretty bleak setup, but also correct in terms of having gone through once again another summer of intense wildfires throughout the province of BC. Just a few years ago, Lytton burned down, and I'm from small town BC. My parents had to evacuate in 2017, and there's a great book, Fire Weather, out right now with John Valiant, who's based here in Vancouver around the Fort McMurray fires, but all of the implications of what's happening today. And in our lifetime, things are going to get worse before they get better in many respects. And wondering if you can speak building on, of course. And you also say, there's like these artistic and theoretical kind of movements like accelerationism that emerged, but it was almost like, it was like a fad. It lasted like 18 months or 24 months, although it's still around. But wondering if you can speak to this project Beyond the World's End, which I have right in front of me.
Yeah, contending with that experience, that sense of bleakness, really is an important part of what drives my work, as well as the commitment not to surrender to it. And that's no easy thing, as you're pointing out. Like I being based in Santa Cruz, we're in a fire vulnerable area, and have experienced wildfire risk and threats that have displaced people, led to deaths, all sorts of really awful stuff in recent years, and we know that will likely get worse in the near future. So like what that means, how to situate a confrontation with bleakness without surrendering to fatalism and negativity, catastrophism is that was part of the the motivation behind that book. Like let's talk about the world's end, or the ending of multiple worlds, which is ultimately what I try to open up at the beginning of that book. Because the question, the quote that you read from, of course, it goes on to challenge some of the assumptions of some of those phrases. Specifically, what I've learned is that climate anxiety is distinctly a kind of, often a liberal settler anxiety, which is largely attuned, owing to climate science and mainstream media, to a near future climate disaster. So the apocalypse is generally in front of us. It's something that we may be entering into, but it's in the future. Whereas we know from other communities, other research, other scholars, activists, practitioners, that maybe the catastrophe is not in the future, but it has already occurred. And in the book, I cite, for instance, the work of the Anishinaabe scholar Lawrence Gross, who argues that indigenous peoples have long struggled with what he calls a post-apocalypse stress syndrome. In other words, that we're effectively living in the aftermath of world-ending disaster, which is that of settler colonialism, which has ended the world effectively for indigenous people long ago, 500 years ago, or at least a cascade of multiple endings, leaving multiple survivors as well, struggling against the continuity, the ongoingness of those ends as well. There's also the work of Black studies scholars like Christina Sharp and her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being, which examines the conditions of Black existence, again, in the wake of a world-ending disaster, in this case, racial slavery or that world-ending cataclysm. So ultimately, the book is an investigation of the cultural and experiential terms of what it means to live within the midst of these multiple apocalypses, and how to think about the ethical and political imperative to connect them. The indigenous scholar Zoe Todd argues for this as well, that we have to not just register the existence of multiple endings of worlds, but actually do the work of thinking of connecting them. And that provided some provocation for the methodological basis of the book, where I try to do some of that work and think intersectionally between apocalypses in addressing artistic and aesthetic projects of people like John Akomfra and Arthur Jaffa, Angela Melitopoulos, different practitioners that are actually mobilizing often film and video, but not just, in relationship to these the ongoingness of disaster and what life is like in the wake, and what kinds of possibilities for struggle exist to reach potential points of emancipation from all of this. I'm also looking at activist practices like the indigenous convergence against the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, figures in the book. And that was also part of the methodological basis of attempting to place art and activism on a spectrum of political aesthetics instead of opposing them, as do many gatekeepers of contemporary art, so as to ask ultimately the question, what comes after the world's end, or the endings of multiple worlds, which opens a discussion of emancipatory futures that might ultimately surpass the 500-year project of racial colonial capitalism. So that's really a big part of that book, and obviously sets up the conditions for my most recent project on radical futurisms.
Yeah, which I just wanted to say I really enjoyed reading. I thought it was really on point from Sternberg Press, Radical Futurisms, Ecologies of Collapse, Chronopolitics, and the Justice to Come. And you lay out through visual culture and social justice movements the questions that come after the many end-of-world narratives we have before us. But wondering if you can maybe define or speak a little bit to, before we speak about the book, the term chronopolitics and what you mean by justice to come.
Sure. Chronopolitics is a term that refers to the time of politics, right? Chronos, it brings chronos and politics together. So there's the time of politics as well as the politics of time. And in terms of that, what I'm referring to is, the time of politics within dominant political experience is such that within representative or so-called representative democracy, within liberal capitalism, we're called on to be political a few times every few years when it comes to, say, voting. That's the dominant experience. Many people even opt out of that. So, in other words, our relation to the political is strongly restricted according to this kind of temporal configuration. And chronopolitics then would challenge that limitation and insist on opening up the temporality of politics to, for instance, the way we organize conditions of everyday life. It also challenges the politics of time, the way time has been increasingly dominated and defined by capitalism's calculative machinery. Like the way many experience this is through wage labor and clock time, punching in and out of a clock, getting paid for that time, thinking of monetizing time, time as money, all of these kinds of dominant ways of thinking about temporality within the dominant economy is what I'm trying to identify and challenge, again, in terms of calling attention to different ways of understanding temporality and thereby politicizing it so as to challenge that calculative machinery of capitalism. So one example is the work of the Philadelphia-based Afrofuturist collective called Black Quantum Futurism. They do a lot of work thinking about temporality within their practice, which is it's mixed media, it's music, it's sonic futurism, it's oral future telling, it's community organizing, it's doing anti-gentrification work on the ground in areas of Philadelphia that have experienced a lot of discriminatory housing practices over the years. And they identify the imperative for them of escaping what they call the master's clockwork universe. In other words, the long history of racial capitalism and the way it's defined temporality that have affected Black lives in all sorts of ways, in terms of projecting stereotypes onto them, delimiting experience, oppressing labor conditions. And this is also similar to, in some ways, the way indigenous artists like the collective Super Futures Haunt Collective, they're a Northwest-based collective, indigiqueer group of performance and mixed media artists who talk about the dispossessive chronology of colonialism that projects indigenous communities into, for instance, an anthropological obsolescence, as if indigeneity is by definition of and in the past, not in the present, let alone the future. And there's just amazing resurgence of voices challenging these dominant views and these temporal constructions that are deeply oppressive and have been ongoing for a long time. So Chronopolitics then helps identify other times of liberation, of emancipation, like, for instance, Black quantum futurism drawing on Afro-diasporic temporalities. Like they're researching the Dogon of Mali in terms of an Afrocentric practice of temporality that is attuned to seasons of agriculture, as well as cosmologies of mythological time. They're also drawing on quantum field theory, which is really fascinating, which attempts to overcome Newtonian linear time in favor of new modes of temporal agency. Black quantum futurism likes to develop experimental practices of what they call retrocausality, the fact that causality is not necessarily based within a linear projection of past that constructs the future, but actually the present, according to them, can intervene in the past and rewrite conditions of the future. They also talk about the superpositioning of events that quantum field theory opens up, like being in two places at once. And these formations, these theoretical formations, enable new kinds of political possibilities, which I'm trying to develop in terms of chronopolitics. Also, in going back to ultimately the work of Walter Benjamin, who figures, somewhat prominently in certain chapters of the book. And he was, of course, he talked about the imperative of developing an anti-fascist historiography. He was theorizing shortly before his death, in the face of German Nazism, the necessity of rejecting fascism's tendency to project historical inevitability as if it was the ineluctable result of progressive development, instead of being the genocidal anti-modern regression that it actually was. So this is, I think, really important to think about historically. And it is also, unfortunately, becoming increasingly relevant in terms of the present, in terms of, what's happening these days in relation to the resurgence of fascisms today. So ultimately, chronopolitics is one way to try to politicize time in order to intervene in this current emergency politics that is leading to fascism.
I'm wondering, TJ, if you could speak a little bit to, in discussions around environment and climate change, there also seems to be a trend around fascist or authoritarian kind of views, the language of blood and soil that reaps into the more right-wing forms of environmental movement or discussions around climate change, or something that gets distorted into a form of authoritarian populism that seems to tie into a kind of green or environmental agenda, which is, of course, troubling. But certainly we see it in France with Marine Le Pen. You see it to some degree in Italy, but other examples as well. Wondering if you can speak to kind of that aspect of the environmental movement or climate discourses that take a kind of reactionary tone.
Absolutely. It's a real growing problem and challenge politically today that we need to continue to think about. I recently read the book by Andreas Malm and the Zedkin Collective called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, which offers, I thought, a really good overview, especially of European varieties, with some attention to the States as well, of this conjugation of international white supremacy with petrocapitalism that expresses itself in relationship to a strong xenophobic and anti-migrant politics. which spells out the danger of fossil fascism for them. In the American context, this would refer to Trump's like pro-fossil fuel ethno-nationalism as an exemplary crystallization of this project that has deep roots and indeed goes back to the history of early 20th century fascisms. So I think this is important to follow, especially within thinking about environmental politics these days. And I think there's something here that is, that connects fossil fascism to liberal green capitalism ultimately. I mean, these are not opposed so much. Rather, green capitalism tends to share the same economic interests as fossil fascism, even if they're not exactly the same social ones. But when the dominant economic system increasingly cannibalizes the political system, and here I'm thinking about the work of Nancy Fraser and her recent book, Cannibal Capitalism, the end result, not surprisingly, is a kind of authoritarianism that can't seem to help relying on these tried and true tactics of social division, meaning, in this case, structural racism, in order to disempower any and all opposition. And that seems to be an accurate analysis of where we are these days, where just the extractivism of the dominant economic system has cannibalized the political possibilities of resistance to it. And the result of that is increasingly extreme forms of authoritarianism, even, increased articulation of the dreams of capitalism without democracy that we're seeing in all sorts of places, that is leading also to increased violence of a militarized police state to shut down opposition to the conditions of this anti-ecological, political, economic death drive toward planetary disaster. So, how can we analyze these conditions and organize against it? One area that I'm thinking about these days and connects in some ways to radical futurisms, which addresses one possible area, one important area of divisiveness, which relates to identity politics, for instance. Another one is, the divisive binary between jobs versus the environment, which we hear so much about. That's a major obstacle to a climate justice organizing that would insist on bringing labor and ecology together in order to form a majoritarian anti-capitalist opposition. And so that's something that I'm thinking about. Others are posing the stakes of that struggle, like Matt Huber's recent book, Climate Change as Class Struggle. Ultimately, this is shaping up to be a major site of struggle today against ecofascism, ultimately.
Matt Huber, ran into him in Banff a number of years ago. The Banff Research and Culture that Imre Zeman used to put together. And he's got strong links, I think, with Jeff Mann, who teaches in SFU's geography department. I had a question around, just last week we interviewed Travis Holloway, who has a really great book out on called How to Live at the End of the World. It also found a nice link with your work talking about futurity and multi-species flourishing. And also, interestingly, both in your work and Travis's work, these themes of friendship and community come up in the context of ecological questions. And I'm working on a book with my collaborator, Matt Hearn, around friendship and community in light of waves of authoritarian populism, but also inside of the larger existential ecological question today. And so that part of your most recent book resonated with me as towards the end of it. Those themes seem to be being picked up by a number of people in different contexts. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that notion of multi-species flourishing, what radical democracy might look like beyond the human. How do we rethink these notions of friendship and community beyond Jean-Luc Nancy and other people? Is that we have to kind of, how do we think about the ecological, or how do we make those philosophical questions new in the context, the ecological context that we're in today?
In the book, I opt for the term comradeship rather than friendship or community, even though I think there's some overlap with those terms. But I'm moved to think about comradeship in relationship to the recent work of Jody Dean and to the need for thinking about more specifically political forms of relationality. Not that friendship and community couldn't also be discussed in this way, but my entry point was through comradeship. Maybe it's because it's also a term that's used frequently and commonly within socialist organizing contexts, including within DSA. And I wanted to think more about this term of political solidarity as well. Solidarity being a concept that really is in many ways alien to artistic practices and art world systems, because of course within the art context that's been so thoroughly commercialized and institutionalized over the last century or so, the system is just ruled by competitive individualism, as in, that's policed and managed in all sorts of ways. So how can we think about solidarity, which of course is a really strong concept that binds a lot of organizing practices within the political sphere. But insofar as some of us want to bring artistic practices and activist or political engagements together, often solidarity is something that doesn't really translate so easily. So this is something I wanted to discuss and set up, and again, to try to theorize the possibilities of, and ultimately, I would argue, the necessity of multiracial forms of solidarity across difference. And that means contending with the divisiveness of identity politics, where I found the work of people like Assad Haider, especially his book, Mistaken Identity.
Yeah, he's been a guest on our show.
All right, great. He's also did his PhD at UCSD here in Santa Cruz. And worked with Max Tomba, who's in the History of Consciousness program, and wrote an important book called Insurgent Universality, which Assad draws on and I end up drawing on as well, because I find it really enabling in terms of theorizing conditions of a universality that is not the same as the dangerous universalism that hides a hidden, often European white particularity within it. So how can we rethink insurgent universality and along with it, the conditions of solidarity at the same time? So that becomes a really important element. And that's something I extend then to beyond the human toward the prospect of what some people would call multi-species justice or multi-species flourishing, which I too want to think about and have done some work on, including beyond this recent book, Radical Futurisms. I recently wrote an essay for a Spanish publication that addressed the topic of extinction and the visual culture that goes along with it, where I compared some of the work of like liberal photojournalism and conservation, such as the photographer Joel Sartori, who's done these images of at-risk species that are like portraits of animals that are at risk, that try to mobilize compassion that can then catalyze politicization in order to challenge the extinction crisis, but remains, at least according to my reading, very much within a liberal framework of generating guilt, demanding compassion, but not really offering any concrete steps to how to challenge the ultimate elephant in the room, which is, the dominant economic system that's not only is providing the conditions of the mass species extinction crisis that we're living through right now, but also is the very system that this photographer, Joel Sartori, is relying on to fund his practice. So, liberalism is filled with all these contradictions. Against this, I posed the work of the Dutch artist Jonas Staal and the British academic Radha de Souza and their project called the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, which was a multi-day public tribunal that placed extractive and fossil capitalist corporations and states on trial for driving climate breakdown and the extinction crisis. And within this context, they referred to extinct animals as comrades. And part of the set design for this project was these signs that were held up with images of different animals that have gone extinct, with the word comrade in different languages written on them. So that's just a small part of this testimony-driven project but was using the language of political solidarity across species. which I found really provocative and compelling in terms of offering an opportunity to think about these kinds of speculative possibilities of theorizing relationality according to this political form of solidarity. What does it mean to have solidarity with extinct species? So I deal with that in the essay and ultimately come around to suggesting that maybe we could be thinking about extinction as a form of a strike, as a labor withdrawal from world systems against this deadly exploitation and environmental destruction. And this is a kind of proposal that I have because ultimately, the idea of multi-species flourishing is more of a climate justice demand than an accurate reading of current circumstances. Really, we're headed in exactly the opposite direction of multi-species flourishing, where we're headed toward multi-species extinction. So if we rethink extinction as a strike, that may risk a kind of anthropomorphism. In other words, turning animals into striking workers. But that itself may work against a larger anthropocentrism, which I'm interested in, and points toward what I think is a necessary reconciliation of labor and environmentalism for an effective struggle for life. And, the work of Jonas Stahl and Rada de Souza may not get us very far practically in relationship to that, but it's a small step, I think, that offers some really helpful speculative ways of rethinking conditions of comradeship in relationship to multi-species being and relationality. And, this is something that art offers, is these areas of speculative fabulation that can enable, in the best case, modes of political engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly around what you were talking about earlier around solidarity, Astor Taylor is writing a lot around that. Brian Masumi continues to write and think about the more than human, and many others as well. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to projects either you have that you're currently working on now, or that you hope to get to in the future. What are you thinking about today in terms of where your work is taking you?
Well, after writing a book like Radical Futurisms, which ultimately is very hopeful, or maybe to invoke the term of Yarimar Bonilla, maybe it's pessimistically optimistic. There's I have a little bit of a sense that it's too positive, and I want to keep thinking about, and I think it's important to do so, to think about like what is if we can identify horizons of emancipation, which for me would necessarily be an anti-capitalist horizon that supersedes the conditions of racial and colonial capitalism. What's keeping us from getting there? Obviously, there's organizing challenges, there's problems on the left, there's all sorts of stuff, but ultimately there are real oppressive forces that are preventing organization, that are preventing political transition, that's preventing the real material challenging of the system of fossil capitalism, fossil fascism. So I'm wanting to think about the conditions of the administration of racial colonial capitalism. Ultimately, this has to do with policing. I was in Germany during the winter last year, and there were a couple of events that were unfolding at the time when I was there. One was the struggle in Germany against the demolition of Lützerath in favor of lignite coal mining. And there was a big resistance movement to save Lützerath against this extractive fossil fuel project. At the same time, there was mobilization against Cop City in the US, in Atlanta, Georgia, where environmentalists and social justice activists, anti-racist abolitionists, and indigenous communities were struggling against this formation of a large-scale police training center construction called Cop City. This like 94 million, and now it's even, I think, up to 130 or $140 million project that will support the training of counterinsurgency policing that emerged after, in some ways ironically, but not surprisingly, after the Black Lives Matter manifestations of the last few years, which, according to the right, were the scenes of very violent resistance. So according to them, according to the right, the answer is not to defund the police. Rather, it's to train the police even more, which means, directing more and more resources toward policing. So this formation of Cop City, the resistance is definitely inspiring and hugely important, but it also is, I think, deeply symptomatic of what's happening these days in relationship to fossil fascism. That is the conjuncture of police militarization, of counterinsurgency training, of racialized environmental injustice, of forest and ecological destruction, of using lawfare and the weaponization of terrorism, charges against nonviolent protesters. So I want to think about that. I'm looking into that and reading a lot about that, researching the conditions of Cop City and also the policing strategies that are going along with this, to think about ultimately like counterinsurgency, which is an important term that theorists like Stuart Schrader in a recent book talks about as something that precedes and constructs the insurgency that it wants to combat. So counterinsurgency comes first before the insurgency. It's something that anticipates insurgency and prepares for it and criminalizes it in advance. So this is, something that is really, I think, disturbing, but also important for organizers on the left who are opposing these conditions might be thinking about, which is how to develop a kind of counterinsurgency, how to, again, anticipate the resistance to the mounting opposition to Cop City in a way that anticipates the counterinsurgency strategies of the state. So this is, in some ways, it connects to radical futurisms. There's the theorist Jasbir Puar who talks about this term prehensive futurity, which means, prehensive in terms of being able to grab things. So to grab the future is a way to describe how states and military authoritarianism tends to construct the future that it wants to guarantee in advance so that it can prepare for it and then be assured of profiting from it. It's a right-wing strategy. So I want to think, this poses the challenge for those of us who want to challenge this, which is how to come up with a prehensive futurity on the left. Like, what would a counterinsurgency be that would challenge the conditions that are developing within Cop City today, where Cop City is just, it's one instance of an arguably global set of phenomenon that's happening today. And, what Malm and the Zetkin Collective call fossil fascism. This is really the struggle for our world, for what the world can be and for the future. So it's very early days, but this is the kind of stuff that I'm thinking about and working on right now.
Mm-hmm. And Jasbir Puar just, I think, very recently moved to Vancouver to take up a position at UBC. I haven't met Jasbir yet, but hopefully soon she'll be a guest on the show.
I heard that. That would be great.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to add, TJ?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. We would talk about a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
Thanks again for having me.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with TJ Demos. You can learn more about his book, Radical Futurisms, and some of his other works in the show notes below. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.